On the evening of October 27th, 1961, at approximately 5:02 p.m., 10 M48 Patton tanks of the United States Army's 2nd Battalion, 6th Infantry Regiment rolled into position along Friedrichstrasse in West Berlin, their 90-millimeter cannons aimed directly at the concrete barriers and sandbag emplacements that marked Checkpoint Charlie, the most famous crossing point between the American and Soviet sectors of the divided city. The temperature that evening was 43 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light rain that had been falling intermittently since early afternoon, making the cobblestones slick and reflecting the streetlights in pools of water that gathered in the worn grooves between the stones. Within minutes, in response to the American deployment, 10 Soviet T-54 tanks emerged from the streets of East Berlin and took up positions approximately 75 yards away, their own cannons trained on the American armor. For the next 16 hours, the two most powerful militaries on Earth would face each other across a distance so short that tank commanders on both sides could see each other's faces through binoculars in what would become the most direct and dangerous military confrontation of the entire Cold War. If you're fascinated by these moments when the world stood at the brink, real documented crises where individual decisions shaped history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these carefully researched Cold War stories every week, uncovering the human reality behind the historical events. Now, let's understand exactly how this confrontation developed. The crisis that brought these tanks to Checkpoint Charlie had been building for months, rooted in the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Berlin's existence since the end of World War II. The city, located more than 100 miles inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, had been divided into 4 occupation sectors in 1945: American, British, French, and Soviet. By 1961, the 3 western sectors had effectively merged into West Berlin, a capitalist island surrounded by communist territory, while the Soviet sector had become East Berlin, the capital of the German Democratic Republic. The boundary between East and West Berlin ran through the middle of the city, cutting across streets, dividing neighborhoods, and splitting families. That relative freedom of movement ended abruptly on August 13, 1961, when East German authorities, acting with Soviet approval, began constructing a barrier to seal off East Berlin from the west. What started as barbed wire and concrete posts would eventually become the Berlin Wall, a fortified barrier that would divide the city for 28 years. The immediate trigger was the exodus of East Germans fleeing to the west through Berlin. More than 2.5 million people had left East Germany since 1949, with over 200,000 departing in the first 7 months of 1961 alone. The loss of population, particularly skilled workers and professionals, devastated East Germany's economy and deeply embarrassed the Soviet Union. The wall's construction generated international outrage and severely heightened tensions. President John F. Kennedy, in office less than 8 months, denounced the barrier, but ultimately decided not to challenge it militarily, concluding that while the division was regrettable, preventing free movement within a communist-controlled city did not constitute grounds for military action. The United States reinforced its garrison in West Berlin and sent Vice President Lyndon Johnson to the city as a symbolic gesture, but took no action to tear down the barrier. However, one critical aspect remained unresolved: the status of Allied personnel traveling between West Berlin and East Berlin. Since World War II's end, American, British, and French civilian and military personnel had enjoyed the right to cross into East Berlin without showing identification to East German border guards, a right derived from the Four-Power Agreement that governed Berlin since 1945. The Western Allies recognized only Soviet authority in East Berlin, not the East German government, which they did not officially acknowledge as legitimate. When American diplomats or military officers crossed at Checkpoint Charlie, they showed credentials to Soviet officers, not to East German guards. The East German government, led by Walter Ulbricht and backed by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, sought to change this arrangement. They wanted Western personnel to show identification to East German border guards, thereby implicitly recognizing East German sovereignty. For the Western Allies, particularly the United States, this was unacceptable. Showing identification to East German guards would constitute de facto recognition of the East German regime and undermine the Western position that only the four powers had legitimate authority in Berlin. This disagreement simmered after the wall's construction, but came to a head in late October 1961. The immediate catalyst was a seemingly minor incident involving an American civilian official named Allan Lightner, who served as the senior U.S. diplomat in Berlin, heading the U.S. mission. Lightner, 51 years old, had been a career Foreign Service officer since 1936 and had served in diplomatic posts worldwide. He was married to Dorothy Lightner, 49, and they lived in government-provided housing in the American sector. On the afternoon of October 22, 1961, Lightner and his wife decided to attend a performance at the Komische Oper, an opera house in East Berlin. Such cultural excursions were not unusual for Western diplomats. Despite political division and rising tensions, some degree of normal cultural life continued in both halves of the city. Lightner drove his government sedan, bearing American diplomatic plates, to Checkpoint Charlie at approximately 6:45 p.m. The normal procedure would have been for Lightner to present his credentials to the Soviet officer on duty, receive clearance, and proceed to the opera. Instead, when Lightner arrived, he was stopped by East German border guards, known as Volkspolizei, or Vopos, who demanded to see his identification. Lightner, following U.S. policy, refused. He stated that as an American diplomat, he was required to show credentials only to Soviet authorities, not to East German personnel. The East German guards insisted. Lightner continued to refuse. The standoff lasted approximately 45 minutes, with neither side willing to back down. Eventually, Lightner and his wife turned their car around and returned to West Berlin without attending the opera. Lightner immediately reported the incident to his superiors, who transmitted the information up the chain of command to the American mission in Berlin, to U.S. European Command, and ultimately to Washington. The incident was viewed seriously because it represented a direct challenge to American rights in Berlin and, by extension, to the Western position on the divided city's status. Senior American officials discussed the appropriate response. The consensus was that the United States could not allow this challenge to stand. If East German authorities were permitted to deny access to American personnel based on their refusal to show identification, it would establish a precedent that would fundamentally alter the status quo and represent a significant victory for the Soviet East German position. The decision was made to test the issue again, but this time with a demonstration of American willingness to enforce its rights. 2 days later, on October 25th, the test was arranged. Lightner would again attempt to cross into East Berlin to attend a theater performance. However, this time, American military personnel from the Berlin Brigade would be positioned nearby, ready to intervene if East German guards again attempted to prevent Lightner's passage. At approximately 7:15 p.m. on October 25th, Lightner again drove to Checkpoint Charlie. East German guards again demanded identification. Lightner again refused. This time, when the guards continued to insist, 4 U.S. Army jeeps approached the checkpoint, each carrying armed military police in full combat gear. helmets, body armor, loaded M14 rifles. The escalation was immediate and unmistakable. The Soviet officer on duty immediately recognized this was no routine incident. He contacted his superiors in the Soviet military command in East Berlin. Within 10 minutes, Soviet troops began arriving at the checkpoint in greater numbers. The standoff that evening lasted approximately 90 minutes. American military police maintained their position near Lightner's vehicle. Soviet troops took up positions on the East Berlin side. East German guards, caught between their Soviet backers and the Americans, maintained their demand, but with visibly increasing nervousness as heavily armed soldiers from both superpowers gathered around them. Eventually, Soviet officers intervened directly. According to American reports, a Soviet colonel approached the East German guards and, speaking in German, ordered them to allow Lightner to pass. The guards, recognizing they were being overruled by their Soviet allies, stepped aside. Lightner drove into East Berlin, attended the theater performance, and returned to West Berlin several hours later without further incident. American officials concluded that the Soviet Union was ultimately willing to back down when confronted with a show of force, and that East German attempts to exercise control over Western access would not be supported by the Soviets if it risked military confrontation. Soviet officials, however, drew a different conclusion. They saw the American deployment of military personnel to escort a diplomat as unnecessary and provocative escalation, and began to suspect the United States was deliberately testing Soviet resolve and willingness to stand behind East German authority. Over the next 2 days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. American officials in Berlin, with support from Washington, decided to continue testing East German compliance with Allied access rights. Several more American officials attempted to cross into East Berlin, and in each case, when East German guards demanded identification, American military personnel were deployed to support the crossing. The pattern repeated: American official arrives, East German guards demand identification, American official refuses, American military police arrive, Soviets intervene to allow passage. The Soviet leadership, watching these repeated incidents, began to interpret them not as legitimate exercises of Allied rights, but as a deliberate campaign to humiliate East German border guards and undermine East German sovereignty. Khrushchev, who had invested considerable political capital in supporting East Germany and had personally approved the wall's construction, saw the American actions as a challenge requiring response. Late on October 26th, Moscow time, Khrushchev authorized Soviet military commanders in East Germany to take whatever measures necessary to support East German border guards and demonstrate that the Soviet Union would not tolerate what it viewed as American bullying. The specific form that support would take was left to local Soviet commanders' discretion, but the message was clear. The Soviets were prepared to escalate if the Americans continued their pattern. On the afternoon of October 27th, another American official attempted to cross into East Berlin at Checkpoint Charlie. East German guards demanded identification. The official refused. American military police were summoned and arrived at the checkpoint. This time, however, the Soviet response was different. At approximately 4:45 p.m., reports began reaching American military headquarters that Soviet tanks were moving through East Berlin streets toward Checkpoint Charlie. The information came from multiple sources: American military observers with sightlines into the east, intelligence monitoring of Soviet military radio communications, and reports from West Berlin civilians who could see tank movements from their windows. The commander of the U.S. Berlin Brigade, Colonel Glover S. Johns, Jr., was immediately informed. Johns, a career Army officer who had served in World War II and Korea, faced a decision that needed to be made quickly: how to respond to the Soviet tank deployment. Standing orders were clear in principle, but left considerable room for interpretation. American forces were to maintain Allied rights in Berlin, respond to any Soviet military provocation with an appropriate demonstration of American capability and resolve, but not initiate combat unless attacked. Johns made the decision to deploy American armor to Checkpoint Charlie. He later explained in his official report that he believed the Soviet tank deployment was intended to intimidate American personnel and signal that the Soviets were prepared to use force to support East German border procedures. Johns concluded the appropriate American response was to demonstrate equal capability and equal willingness to use force if necessary. At approximately 5:02 p.m., 10 M48 Patton tanks from the 2nd Battalion, 6th Infantry Regiment began moving toward Checkpoint Charlie. The tanks were fully armed and combat-ready, with crews at battle stations. Each tank carried a crew of 4, a commander, a gunner, a loader, and a driver. The tank commanders had been briefed on their mission: take up positions facing the checkpoint, demonstrate American presence and capability, but do not fire unless fired upon. The tanks arrived and deployed on Friedrichstrasse, cannons oriented toward the East German barriers and the Soviet positions beyond, close enough that tank commanders could see each other's faces, close enough that combat would be measured in seconds. Inside the tanks, the reality was far removed from strategic calculations in Washington or Moscow. Tank crews dealt with immediate physical discomfort: cold metal surfaces, confined spaces, the inability to leave their positions, even to relieve themselves. One American tank commander later recalled the surreal experience of tracking a Soviet tank through his sights for hours, occasionally catching glimpses of the Soviet gunner doing the same to him. Two men who had never met engaged in a mechanical dance of mutual targeting that neither wanted to culminate in firing. The tank crews on both sides maintained positions through the evening and into the night. As darkness fell, the checkpoint was illuminated by streetlights and by the headlights of the tanks themselves, creating harsh shadows and pools of light in which soldiers watched each other. The temperature dropped into the upper 30s Fahrenheit. The light rain stopped, but the air remained damp and cold. Tank crews, unable to leave their vehicles without potentially triggering some response, remained at their stations for hours. In Washington, it was mid-afternoon when word reached the White House. President Kennedy was informed at approximately 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time during a meeting with advisers. The president immediately convened an emergency meeting of his senior national security team, including Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Lyman Lemnitzer. The group gathered in the cabinet room and received updates from military communications channels maintaining contact with U.S. forces in Berlin. The situation was described: 10 American tanks and 10 Soviet tanks facing each other at close range, with crews at battle stations and weapons ready to fire. Any accident, any miscalculation, any nervous soldier's mistake could trigger a shooting exchange that would escalate almost immediately into full military confrontation between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces. Kennedy's primary concern: what exactly was the United States risking war over? The immediate issue was whether American diplomats had to show identification to East German border guards. Kennedy, who had spent much of 1961 managing international crises, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, rising tensions over Laos, the Vienna summit with Khrushchev that had gone badly, the wall's construction, was acutely aware of how easily tensions could spiral beyond control. However, Kennedy's advisers, particularly Rusk and Bundy, emphasized that the issue was not minor. The question of whether American personnel had to show identification to East German authorities was fundamentally about Berlin's status and whether the Western Allies would accept the legitimacy of the East German regime. If the United States backed down, it would set a precedent that could undermine the entire legal and political framework governing Western rights in Berlin. That framework, established by agreements between the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and France at World War II's end, was the foundation for the Western presence in Berlin and for West Berlin's survival as a democratic enclave in communist territory. Kennedy authorized his team to attempt to open communications with the Soviet Union to seek de-escalation. The challenge was that normal diplomatic channels moved slowly, and the situation in Berlin was developing rapidly. The State Department contacted the Soviet embassy in Washington, requesting an urgent meeting. Simultaneously, American diplomats in Moscow sought meetings with Soviet Foreign Ministry officials. In Berlin itself, American military commanders maintained their position, but sought to avoid any action that might trigger combat. Colonel Johns issued strict orders to all American forces: maintain positions, remain at high alert, but under no circumstances take any action that could be interpreted as aggressive unless Soviet forces initiated hostile action first. Tank crews were instructed to keep weapons trained on Soviet positions, but to keep hands visible and make no sudden movements that might be misinterpreted as preparation to fire. On the Soviet side, similar calculations were being made. The Soviet tank commander, whose specific identity was never conclusively confirmed in Western records, was operating under orders that required him to demonstrate Soviet strength and resolve, but avoid initiating combat unless absolutely necessary. His tanks had been positioned to match the American deployment and signal that the Soviet Union would not be intimidated. However, he was also aware that if shooting started, he and his men would almost certainly die in the first minutes, and their deaths might trigger a general war. He maintained strict fire discipline, ordering his tank commanders to track American tanks with their weapons, but not to load or aim in a manner suggesting imminent attack. The hours passed. Midnight came and went. The tanks remained in position. In Washington, it was now evening, and Kennedy remained at the White House receiving updates every 30 minutes. In Moscow, it was early morning of October 28th, and Khrushchev was being briefed by his military and foreign policy advisors. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev faced the same problem. Neither wanted war, but neither could afford to appear weak. The challenge was finding a way to de-escalate without appearing to capitulate. The solution emerged through informal back-channel communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev that bypassed official diplomatic processes and allowed the two leaders to communicate more directly and candidly than formal diplomatic notes permitted. According to declassified records that became available years later, Kennedy conveyed to Khrushchev through these channels that while the United States would not challenge the wall itself or threaten the East German regime, it could not accept East German control over Allied access to East Berlin. Kennedy suggested that if Soviet forces withdrew from Checkpoint Charlie, American forces would also withdraw, and the two sides could work through diplomatic channels to establish mutually acceptable procedures. Khrushchev, dealing with his own internal political pressures and aware that military confrontation in Berlin could spiral into nuclear war, responded positively. He indicated through the same channels that the Soviet Union did not seek confrontation but had deployed tanks in response to what appeared to be American provocations involving repeated deployments of military forces to the checkpoint. If the Americans would withdraw their tanks, the Soviets would do likewise. The key issue was who would withdraw first. Neither side wanted to be seen as backing down. The solution was that both sides would withdraw simultaneously, with timing coordinated but without public acknowledgement that coordination had occurred. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Berlin time on October 28th, 16 hours after the American tanks had first deployed, both sides received orders to begin withdrawal. The Soviet tanks began backing away from their positions slowly, moving in reverse to maintain their cannons oriented toward the American positions until they were far enough back to safely turn around. Simultaneously, American tanks began their own withdrawal, also moving in reverse initially before turning and returning to their regular garrison positions. One American tank commander later described the moment when the Soviet tanks began to withdraw as one of profound relief mixed with lingering tension. He and his crew had spent more than 16 hours at battle stations, maintaining continuous vigilance, knowing that any second could bring the order to fire or incoming fire from the Soviet tanks. When the order came to withdraw, there was no celebration, only careful execution of the movement procedure and deep fatigue once they were clear of the checkpoint area. The tanks withdrew, but the underlying political issues remained unresolved. The question of whether American diplomats would be required to show identification to East German border guards remained unresolved in formal terms. However, in practical terms, a pattern emerged in the weeks and months following the standoff. American diplomats continued to assert their right to cross into East Berlin without showing identification to East German guards. And, while East German guards continued to request identification, they generally did not prevent passage when Americans refused. Soviet officers at the checkpoints maintained a presence and, in effect, provided the authority for Allied crossings, though the exact nature of this arrangement was never formally codified. The tank confrontation at checkpoint Charlie became one of the most famous incidents of the Cold War, frequently cited as an example of how close the United States and Soviet Union came to direct military conflict. The images of tanks facing each other at point-blank range, of crews at battle stations for hours, of the two superpowers literally staring at each other down the barrels of loaded weapons became symbolic of the entire Cold War era. For the people most directly involved, the experience left lasting impressions. Colonel Johns, who had made the decision to deploy American tanks, later reflected that he had spent the 16 hours acutely aware that his decision might trigger a war. He described being unable to sleep for several days after the crisis ended, replaying in his mind all the possible scenarios of how things might have gone differently. American tank commanders who served at Checkpoint Charlie that night continued their military careers, and many remained in contact with members of their tank crews from that October evening. In interviews given years later, they described how the experience shaped their understanding of military service and of the responsibility that comes with being in position to make decisions that could have catastrophic consequences. The Soviet tank commander apparently faced no negative consequences for his role in the standoff. Little is known about his personal reflections on the incident, as Soviet and later Russian military culture did not encourage the kind of public discussion of decision-making and emotional responses that became more common among American veterans. The crisis had significant political consequences for both sides. For President Kennedy, the successful de-escalation strengthened his confidence in his ability to manage Cold War crises through a combination of military strength and diplomatic flexibility. The experience shaped his approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis less than a year later. For Khrushchev, the incident reinforced his belief that nuclear weapons had fundamentally changed the nature of great power competition. He had backed down at Checkpoint Charlie not because of any weakness in Soviet conventional military capabilities. The Soviet Union had vastly superior forces in and around Berlin, but because he recognized that any military confrontation between American and Soviet forces risked nuclear escalation. This recognition would also shape his decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For the people of Berlin, particularly those in the western sectors, the tank confrontation was both frightening and reassuring. It was frightening because it demonstrated how quickly a seemingly minor dispute could escalate to the brink of war, and how vulnerable Berlin was to becoming the flashpoint for global conflict. But it was also reassuring because it demonstrated American willingness to defend Allied rights in Berlin, even at significant risk, which strengthened West Berliners' confidence that they would not be abandoned to Soviet pressure. The families of soldiers who faced each other at checkpoint Charlie experienced their own version of the crisis. American military wives living in West Berlin learned that their husbands' tank units had been deployed to the checkpoint and did not know whether they would see them again. They spent the night unable to sleep, listening to radio reports and waiting for news. When the tank crews returned to their quarters the next day, exhausted but unharmed, families experienced overwhelming relief, followed by anger at a situation that had put so many at risk over what seemed like an absurd dispute about identification papers. In East Berlin, Soviet tank crew families experienced their own version of the same fear, though their experiences went unrecorded in the Soviet press. The symmetry of anxiety, mothers on both sides wondering if their husbands would return, children on both sides unconscious of how close they came to losing fathers, was one of the Cold War's cruel ironies, invisible to those experiencing it because the ideological divide made such shared humanity unthinkable. The Berlin Wall, which had been the underlying cause of the tensions that led to the Checkpoint Charlie incident, would remain in place for another 28 years. Checkpoint Charlie itself continued to function as the primary crossing point for Allied personnel moving between West and East Berlin throughout the Cold War. The checkpoint became famous not only for the tank confrontation, but also for being the site of numerous dramatic escape attempts by East Germans trying to flee to the West, some successful and some ending in tragedy. The checkpoint's operators on both sides, American military police on the western side, and Soviet and East German border guards on the eastern side, developed a strange professional relationship over the years. They saw each other daily, learned each other's routines and procedures, and developed a kind of mutual understanding even as they represented fundamentally opposed political systems. Some American soldiers who served at Checkpoint Charlie in the years after the tank confrontation later described the experience as surreal. Going through the motions of Cold War confrontation while exchanging nods and occasionally even brief conversations with Soviet officers they saw every day. The human cost of the Berlin Wall extended far beyond the military and diplomatic personnel who managed the checkpoint. An estimated 140 people were killed trying to cross the wall between its construction in 1961 and its fall in 1989. Thousands more were arrested in failed escape attempts. Families were divided for decades, with relatives on opposite sides unable to see each other except in rare, heavily monitored visits. The wall created two separate cities out of what had been one, with different economic systems, different political cultures, different daily realities. The checkpoint Charlie crisis of October 1961 occurred during a period when Cold War tensions were particularly acute. The Berlin Wall had been constructed just 2 months earlier. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion had occurred 6 months before. The Vienna summit between Kennedy and Khrushchev in June 1961 had been confrontational and had left both leaders with negative impressions of each other. The Soviet Union had resumed nuclear weapons testing in September 1961, breaking a testing moratorium that had been in place since 1958. The United States had responded by resuming its own testing. The world felt, to many observers at the time, closer to nuclear war than at any point since World War II's end. In this context, the decision by both Kennedy and Khrushchev to de-escalate the tank confrontation was significant. Both leaders had domestic political constituencies that would have supported a more aggressive stance. Both faced criticism from hardliners who believed their governments were being too accommodating, but both ultimately chose to step back from the brink, to find a way to end the immediate military confrontation, and to preserve the possibility of managing the Cold War competition through means short of direct combat. This decision did not end the Cold War or resolve the fundamental disagreements between the United States and Soviet Union about Germany, Berlin, or the proper organization of international politics. But it did establish a pattern that would be repeated in subsequent crises. That even in moments of high tension and direct military confrontation, both sides retained enough rationality and restraint to avoid allowing the situation to escalate to actual warfare. The question of responsibility for creating the crisis in the first place is complex and has been debated by historians. From the American perspective, the crisis was created by Soviet and East German attempts to change the established procedures for Allied access to East Berlin, which forced the United States to defend its rights through shows of military force. From the Soviet perspective, the crisis was created by American provocations at the checkpoints, with repeated deployments of military personnel in situations where diplomatic channels should have been used to resolve disputes. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. The East German government, backed by the Soviet Union, was indeed attempting to establish new procedures that would have effectively required Western recognition of East German authority. The United States was indeed using repeated tactical deployments of military force to make a point about its unwillingness to accept those new procedures. Each side's actions were responses to what they perceived as the other side's unacceptable behavior, creating an escalatory dynamic that neither side fully controlled. The individual decision-makers on both sides were operating within constraints established by their respective political systems and by the logic of Cold War competition. Colonel Johns made the decision to deploy American tanks at checkpoint Charlie not because he personally wanted military confrontation, but because he interpreted his orders and the situation to require a demonstration of American capability and resolve. His Soviet counterpart deployed Soviet tanks in response, not because he sought war, but because he was following orders from higher command that directed him to support East German border procedures and to match any American military deployments. Both commanders were doing what they understood to be their duty within the systems they served. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, operating at the highest level of decision-making, had more agency than the military commanders on the ground, but even they were constrained by domestic politics, alliance relationships, bureaucratic structures, and the perceived requirements of maintaining credibility in the eyes of adversaries and allies. Kennedy could not be seen as weak in defending Allied rights in Berlin, without risking criticism from domestic political opponents and without potentially encouraging Soviet aggression elsewhere. Khrushchev could not be seen as abandoning East Germany or failing to support communist allies without risking criticism from hardliners in the Soviet leadership and without potentially undermining Soviet influence throughout Eastern Europe. The civilians who lived through the crisis, the residents of Berlin, the families of soldiers on both sides, the people around the world who watched the confrontation through news reports, had the least agency of all. They did not choose the political systems they lived under, they did not create the Cold War, they did not decide to divide Berlin, or to construct the wall, or to deploy tanks to a checkpoint. But they bore the consequences of all these decisions. They lived with the fear that war might start at any moment. They dealt with divided families, with checkpoints and barriers, with the daily absurdity of ideological competition played out in divided cities and armed standoffs. The Berlin Wall finally fell on November 9, 1989, 28 years after the Checkpoint Charlie crisis. The fall came not through military force, but through political change, as reforms in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev, combined with economic pressures and popular protests in East Germany, created conditions in which the East German government could no longer maintain the barrier. When the wall came down, Checkpoint Charlie became obsolete overnight. The barriers were removed, the checkpoints closed, and Friedrichstrasse became once again an ordinary street in a unified city. By 1989, many of the individuals who had been directly involved in the 1961 tank confrontation had died or retired from active service. Some American tank commanders who had served that night watched the fall of the wall on television with profound emotion, reflecting on how the checkpoint where they had spent 16 hours at battle stations had become a symbol of division and was now being dismantled by celebrating crowds. The site of Checkpoint, Charlie became a tourist attraction in reunified Berlin, with a replica guardhouse and actors dressed as American and Soviet soldiers posing for photographs with visitors. The replica bears little resemblance to the actual checkpoint as it existed in 1961, which was a much more austere and utilitarian structure, but it serves as a reminder of the division that once existed and of the confrontations that occurred there. For historians studying the Cold War, the Checkpoint Charlie crisis remains significant as one of the closest approaches to direct military combat between American and Soviet forces during the entire period of East-West confrontation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, which occurred almost exactly 1 year later, is generally considered to have brought the world closer to nuclear war. But it did not involve American and Soviet military forces facing each other at close range with weapons aimed and ready to fire. The Checkpoint Charlie crisis had that quality of immediate physical confrontation that made it unique. The crisis also illustrated the challenges of crisis management in an era of nuclear weapons and ideological competition. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev were acutely aware that a military engagement in Berlin could escalate to nuclear war, but both also faced political pressures and strategic considerations that made backing down difficult. The successful de-escalation required both sides to find ways to step back without appearing to capitulate, to communicate through back channels while maintaining public positions, and to trust that the other side also wanted to avoid war enough to accept a face-saving resolution. These lessons about crisis management, about the importance of clear communication, about providing adversaries with ways to back down, about distinguishing between vital interests and peripheral issues, about the dangers of allowing tactical situations to drive strategic decisions, were learned at considerable risk in Berlin in October 1961. They were applied during the Cuban Missile Crisis a year later. They became part of the institutional knowledge of both American and Soviet foreign policy establishments and influenced crisis management throughout the remainder of the Cold War. The East German border guards who had been on duty at Checkpoint Charlie during the crisis faced their own complicated situation. They were the immediate cause of the confrontation in that their insistence on checking Allied identification had triggered the American response that led to the tank deployment. But they were also, in many ways, pawns in a larger game being played by the Soviet Union and the United States. Their government wanted to establish sovereignty and authority, but when push came to shove, when tanks appeared and war seemed possible, their Soviet allies stepped in and overruled their authority, allowing the Americans to pass without showing identification to East German personnel. After the crisis, East German border procedures at Checkpoint, Charlie became somewhat more flexible in practice, though the East German government never formally abandoned its claim to authority over Allied crossings. A kind of informal compromise emerged. East German guards would request identification, Allied personnel would refuse, Soviet officers would be present and would facilitate passage. This arrangement satisfied no one fully, but avoided the kind of direct confrontation that had led to the tank deployment. The broader question raised by the Checkpoint Charlie crisis is whether the risks taken were proportionate to the interests at stake. Was the principle of Allied access rights in Berlin important enough to justify bringing American and Soviet tanks face-to-face with loaded weapons, knowing that any accident or miscalculation could trigger a war? American officials at the time believed the answer was yes, arguing that if the Western powers showed weakness on access rights, it would invite further Soviet pressure on other aspects of the Berlin situation and potentially on other Cold War flashpoints around the world. Soviet officials, conversely, believed they were defending the sovereignty and dignity of an Allied government and could not afford to appear weak in the face of American military pressure. Both sides operated according to Cold War deterrence theory. Showing weakness in one confrontation would invite challenges elsewhere, while standing firm would deter future provocations. This logic dominated strategic thinking on both sides, even when it meant accepting catastrophic risks over seemingly minor issues. Whether this logic was correct is impossible to prove definitively. We know what happened. Both sides demonstrated their capabilities and their resolve, and then both sides stepped back. We do not know what would have happened if one side or the other had chosen a different approach. Would Soviet and East German authorities have continued pushing on access rights if the United States had not deployed tanks? Would the Soviet Union have withdrawn its tanks if the United States had not been willing to withdraw simultaneously? These counterfactual questions cannot be answered with certainty. What can be stated with certainty is that for 16 hours in October 1961, the world's two most powerful militaries faced each other directly, with weapons ready, and chose not to fire. Tank commanders on both sides had the capability to initiate combat that would have immediately escalated beyond their control. They chose instead to follow orders to maintain discipline, to wait, to give their political leaders time to find a way to end the confrontation. The photograph that became iconic from the Checkpoint Charlie crisis shows American and Soviet tanks facing each other across the checkpoint, weapons aimed, distance measured in yards rather than miles. What the photograph cannot capture is the essential absurdity. Two groups of young men, none of whom had any personal animosity toward each other, none of whom wanted war, sitting in machines designed to kill each other, following orders from leaders who also did not want war, all caught in a system that had taken on a logic of its own. The crisis was resolved not because anyone won or lost, but because enough people at enough levels of decision-making chose to step back from the brink. Tank commanders chose to maintain fire discipline. Political leaders chose to find face-saving compromises. Diplomats chose to open back channels. Each of these choices was small in itself. Together, they prevented war. But the fact that war was prevented should not obscure the fact that it became possible in the first place. The Checkpoint Charlie crisis was not an aberration or an accident. It was the logical outcome of a system, the Cold War, that prioritized ideological competition over human welfare, that armed young men and placed them in positions where microseconds could determine whether millions lived or died, that treated questions of procedure at a checkpoint as matters worth risking nuclear war to resolve. The American and Soviet tank commanders who sat at Checkpoint Charlie that night were in their 20s and 30s, doing their duty as they understood it. So were the political leaders who gave the orders. Everyone was doing their duty, following their orders, serving their systems, and for 16 hours the world balanced on whether those systems, those duties, those orders would prove stronger than the simple human preference not to die and not to kill. They did not. The world survived, but only just.